good afternoon, good evening, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation Digital Trade Conference 2024. I'm really pleased that you can join me, and I'm very pleased to be opening this two-day conference, the first day of which is virtual, the second day of which will be in person here in London. Before we start, I'd like to say thanks very much to our sponsors, who you can see listed at the bottom of the slide there, Arkit and Trade Secure and TraxPay as our silver sponsors, and then eDocs Online, XDC Trade Network, Prima Trade and Wave BL as our bronze sponsors, and for the support of Deloitte, who will be hosting us at tomorrow's live event face-to-face. To those we say a great thank you and for making this possible. Over this next 2 days, we'll be hearing a lot about where we are in terms of digital trade and the expansion of digital trade across the globe. After a lot of hard work by the International Chambers of Commerce, by the Centre, and by many of the stakeholders represented on this call, we've managed to get legislation passed, standards drafted, and accepted by a number of countries globally. And there is a clear move by the industry towards the establishment of quick, secure, and feasible technical solutions to make digital trade quicker, faster, simpler, cheaper, and more sustainable. And our report back in November last year showed that there is plenty of benefits accessible to industry now. This isn't 2 to 3 years' time. These benefits are available now. And the focus for this conference is really about how do we turn those benefits to reality? How do we coordinate the efforts, and how do we ensure that that effort will end up with the open, standardized, and interoperable public architecture that will provide to all trading entities the full end-to-end paperless experience that we think is achievable. So we hope that by the end of today and in person tomorrow, you will come away from this conference with a clear view of what you can do in the very short term and what you can consider doing in the longer term to fully participate in the digital international economy that is in prospect. Just a couple of housekeeping points. If you do have any points to make, please use the Q&A facility on Zoom. We will use the chat for posting of any documents that are referred to, which will hopefully be a lasting reference point for you. But let's turn now to the substantive topic of today's session. And that will be chaired by my colleague, Chris Southworth, who's General Secretary of the International Chambers of Commerce, United Kingdom. Chris, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. And if I can ask my panel to come on screen. I'm delighted to moderate this session. It's a great lineup. Just as people are coming onto screen, we won't go into personal introductions. I'll assume that everybody has looked at the biographies and information on the websites. What we'll do is we'll dive straight in. And given who we have here, we'll start off at a macro international level with all the latest insights and updates from the ICC, the UN, and the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation. And then we'll come to some practical implementation with Max Hakon from the UK Single Trade Window team, and to Nick, who's got 1 foot in government, 1 foot in the ICC, and is really at the sharp end of how we scale the benefits of digitalization, given the change in English law in September last year. So I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to just give us a blast. Please do put questions and answers. I'm conscious that we've got a lot of good people in this session, all experts in your own right. So we are talking to an expert audience. So feel free to ask questions. We'll have a 30-40 minute discussion, and then we'll answer as many questions as we possibly can and really look to have a discussion with some of you with us today. So great, let's kick off Pamela's been all over the world, I think, in recent months, and is actually in the UK next week for those here in the UK. But lots going on at the ICC. Pamela, can I hand over to you to give us an update on what's happening?
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Nick. I'm delighted to be here today because I think we're at a very pivotal moment in the transformation of global trade. Why do I say that? It's because basically the building blocks are all coming together. So if we think, what do we need to transform trade? You want the legal environment to basically get reform, and that's happening. You know, not the UK seems to have started a trend. So obviously France, the US, they're all considering legislation. If I can sort of name the countries in the G20, I would say that at least half are actively preparing for passing the model law on electronic transferable records. Major regions like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, same thing. We no longer hear why should we do this, but simply how. And that is such a good trend. So the thing is, it's in the works. So that's legal. We also need standards, right? We all say we need standards, we need clarity, they need to be simple, they need to provide that roadmap to interoperable data and documents, electronic documents. And for those of you who are watching this space, the DSI has been on this 18-month kind of work stream in order to tie up all 36 key trade documents into a single integrated format. And we're going to launch that next week. And that will provide basically one single connected framework for anyone who wants to digitalize any part of the supply chain. So you follow the recommendation on what to use in terms of the document standard, for the digital document standard, and you'll be on the road to interoperability. And I think the exciting thing is that of the 36 documents, fully 21 are in pretty good states of harmonization and standardization. And so the message there is just go, drive adoption. And that's what we're going to be largely focusing on. So that's standards. The third thing is that if we want people to be able to transact, using data and electronic documents, we have to agree on some basic principles of how to protect that transfer, how to secure it, how do you verify it, how do you authenticate it in terms of the identity of the one who originated the data. And those principles are now mandated under MLETR, but now DSI, working with a group of industry stakeholders, including C4DTI, including standards organizations, including experts on digital trust, we've developed the first technical sort of assessment framework for reliability in the transfer of electronic documents, which will be the foundation for how do we secure the transfer and sharing of data along the supply chain. So this is, again, going to be hopefully getting out into pilot so that we can get feedback. But basically these pieces, legal, standards, digital trust, how do you govern digital trust, what are the principles, these are all now coming into place. And these are absolutely the building blocks for digital trade. And so we put these into place, and now we just need to build. So back to you, Chris. But I'm really excited.
Great. I'm going to come back to a question on standards, which we'll come to an implementation around who's the audience for the standard. Who do we target to get the standards adoption? That's a really live question going on over here in the UK right now. Yeah, and I'm going to come to you next. There's a terrific amount going on at UNESCAP. You are heading up the paperless trade program, massively important actor in all of this. Currently in Kazakhstan today, so that's great. Can you just give us an update in terms of what's on your mind? You've got the latest survey results from UNESCAP. It'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about that. What are you seeing and hearing?
Thank you, Chris, and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I mean, I was listening to Pamela, and she's very optimistic about the digital trade, and so let me share this enthusiasm as well. Although, I mean, the timeline, you know, our views on the timeline it will take may differ slightly, but I think definitely we've seen a lot of progress. And this is reflected in data that we collect, right? I mean, ESCAP is the coordinator of this UN global survey on digital and sustainable trade facilitation. So a big part of that survey is on trade digitalization measures, so really on topic. And so we've seen over the years, you know, good growth in implementation rates, right, across the world. And actually, it's not localized, it's everywhere, right? We see progress, and it's constant progress, or actually it accelerated during the COVID-19 crisis. Because people had to go digital, right? And so, but we thought that it was going to slow down after the COVID-19 crisis, but it didn't. It's still going quite strong, especially in Africa, catching up actually with some of the rest of the world in some areas, right? So just to give you some numbers, we calculate this overall trade facilitation implementation level, right, which stood at 69% globally. So I mean, obviously, if you do everything right, you have full trade digitalization, you get to 100%, right? But we're still far from the 100%, where we had 69% globally, which is a 5 or 6 percentage point improvement from the last time we did the survey, so in 2021, right? We see a lot of variation between regions, between countries. So small Pacific Island countries, for example, have implementation rates of around 45%, right? But the leaders, right, in the developing world is East Asia and Southeast Asia, 77%, and developed country average for reference is about 85%, right? So you actually have some developing, some parts of the world that are considered developing areas, developing countries, is particularly in Asia, but actually doing as well or better than many of the developed countries at this point in time, right? One other thing that we do is we distinguish between paperless trade and cross-border paperless trade, right? So paperless trade being, for example, having a national single window and having, you know, customs declaration filed within the country. And cross-border paperless trade is really about exchange of data and documents across borders, right? And that's when some of the things that Pamela is talking about is very, very important. You need legal recognition. You need international standards. You need to agree on what is a certain level of reliability among documents, and that's very, very challenging to get to, right? So just to give you an idea, at the global level, the implementation rate of cross-border paperless trade measures stands around 40%, right? So well below the average for all of trade facilitation measures, which is closer to 70%. So that's really where there is need to be a focus, right? How do you exchange electronic certificates of origin? How to exchange electronic custom declaration, electronic invoices, and data. Actually, if we're going beyond documents, how do we exchange all the data, trade-related data and documents? So there is capacity gaps to address. There is common international standards that still need to be adopted, although in many cases they are there. Legal frameworks to be implemented, and really there is need for intergovernmental cooperation, because the governments don't collaborate, including with the private sector. You can't get anywhere. And so that's what ESCAP has been focusing on mainly. Let me stop here.
Thanks so much, Jan. Those are really encouraging numbers, I think, actually, aren't they? On the cross-border as well as the what I would call slightly more domestic. I think that's quite, you know, it's good to hear. Really, really interesting. Claire, I'm going to come to you. We've obviously got a big report, just give everyone a heads up, being launched tomorrow, so we can't go too much into that, but you're going to get a bit of a trailer here on the importance of legal entity identifiers, which really are a foundational pillar that underpin everything that Jan and Pamela have just been talking about. So Claire, you two are traveling around the world, and Stefan as well, who will be with us tomorrow. Can you just give us an insight into, you know, what LEIs are, to remind us all what the benefits of those are, and what's, you know, what are you focused on in terms of priorities, challenges, opportunities?
Yes, thank you, Chris. A pleasure to be here today. So indeed, I'll pick up on some of the themes, especially coming from Pamela on the different pillars on standards and digital identity. First, a short introduction of this legal entity identifier of the global legal entity identifier system. The LEI, for short, it is the only open, public, global identifier and system for legal entities. It is regulatory endorsed. It was first envisioned by the G20 leaders now more than 10 years ago. The system itself was founded by the Financial Stability Board. And to date, we, the foundation that manage the operations of the system, we are overseen by something called the Regulatory Oversight Committee, which is composed of more than 65 authorities from all over the world. So this gives you just a bit of feel of what is this legal entity identifier. Something that seems so simple, a 20-digit alphanumeric code connecting to key information that answers the question, who am I doing business with? This LEI, it is a public good, so the identifier itself, it is available online, accessible, free of any sort of IP copyright, as well as all of the associated reference data that describes that legal entity. So how is this LEI coming in? How will it revolutionize digital trade? If we look at the pillars across trade, buy, ship, and pay, we see that the payment is a very critical piece, because without payment, nothing happens. Nobody is going to be contracting for logistics service providers. Nobody is going to be starting production of goods. Payment is a very key piece of the overall picture. And I suggest that some of the activities in payments today will be a catalyst for bringing the LEI into digital trade. So within payments today, since 2020, there has been a major international initiative led by the Financial Stability Board to improve cross-border payments, picking up on some of those same words that Nick introduced at the beginning. So faster, cheaper, more inclusive, and more transparent. And at the core of this is the concept of bringing identity to cross-border payments. For many of us participating today, we know there is no identity in cross-border payments. The only thing necessary to effect a cross-border payment is a live account at the other end. But you could put any name for your supplier. That payment would be processed and it would go through. This is where we see there are important consequences for businesses, important consequences for economies. The Bank of International Settlements estimates that between 2 to 5 trillion US dollars are laundered every year. And if we look at the UK alone, it's estimated that 580 million pounds are lost each year to authorized payment push fraud. So these are some of the consequences of having a lack of transparent party identification in payments. And this is where we see at the global level, from a policymaker perspective, the LEI, the legal entity identifier, is coming in as a solution to bringing identity for the originator and the beneficiary of payments. Most notably is the Financial Action Task Force, an intergovernmental group of policymakers that sets global policy for fighting financial crime, combating terrorism financing. Currently, there is a recommendation 16 related to cross-border payments that is open for consultation. You will find the LEI referenced as an attribute for the originator and the beneficiary. So I suggest, as we talk about the area here, revolutionizing digital trade, this is where you will find this LEI, this open public identifier, and the VLEI, its digital twin, which cryptographically binds the LEI to the organization, will start to open the door to not just the use in payments, which is, you could say, the starting point for any trade, but then more broadly for exchanging documents, as Pamela described, trust frameworks, verifying the origin of signatures, the delegated authority, and etc. So back to you, Chris.
That's really helpful. And there will be a really good crunchy session on this tomorrow, live for those who are with us. I mean, I think the basic thrust of the report that we are publishing is saying we've got some work to do. The identity infrastructure is just not fit for purpose at the moment, linking into the LEI. So we've got some work to do there over the next year or so to make sure that's ready as we all start scaling up. Max, I'm going to come to you. You are, like I say, in the hot seat of a major single trade window program. So this is quite, I think, exciting in the sense that you're building at the very moment as we are bringing in the environment for cross-border digital trade. And I think it's quite useful actually to separate those two, just as Jan did earlier. I know that's in your thinking going forward. Can you just give us some insights as to what you're wrestling with? Massively complex, and where your thinking is in terms of just the practical challenge on the first phases of implementation, and then your latest thinking on that cross-border interoperability piece, and what you think is coming at us as an opportunity.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks, Chris, for the invitation. And it's great to be able to join this this event. And it's actually been really inspiring just listening over the last 10 minutes to some of my panel colleagues. And interestingly, some of the words that have been used to describe our ambitions here in a more macro sense: faster, cheaper, more inclusive. Those words resonate almost perfectly with some of the conversations we've been having just over the last few weeks within our single trade window program in the UK, where we've been trying to find, frankly, punchier ways of describing what we're here to do in the single trade window. And actually, we are here to make the experience at the border faster, cheaper, more inclusive. We don't want people to be kept away from the border due to high barriers of entry. We want it to be a more secure experience for everyone as well. So there's some real, let's call it, strategic resonance with what we're trying to deliver here. If I just take a few minutes just to talk through some of the opportunities or challenges. Sometimes it depends what side of bed you get out of, doesn't it, Chris, whether it's an opportunity or a challenge, but genuinely these are kind of opportunities, so albeit they are crunchy ones. I think as we are progressing through this journey of looking to bring in a single trade window for the United Kingdom, the first thing that we recognise is the border is complex, and we recognise the burdens that drives for users at the border, whether that's in terms of cost, in terms of time, in terms of administration. And one of the internal straplines that we use for our single trade window program, which I think has a real resonance for me in terms of what we're trying to do here, is tell us once at the border. We want to move away from a world where customers have to say the same thing or very similar things to different parts of government, and just take that stress, take that burden away. Just let us know once, and then we'll take care of making sure that the relevant parts of government understand what's happening. And actually, in telling us once, let's try and move away from describing what you have done in a commercial sense through the lens of the regulatory obligations, but just talk to us about what you've been doing commercially, and let us help with interpreting that into information that helps us be confident that things are okay from a regulatory perspective. And I think that presents a genuinely transformational opportunity for users at the border within industry, in terms of not just removing pain points, but actually creating positive gain points, if I can call them that, in terms of having a better understanding of the flow of your goods across the border. But also for government organisations, it gives us the opportunity to have a clear understanding of what our customers are doing, and in turn that can drive better decision making and more targeted decision making, not just in terms of how we intervene in transactions in order to keep our borders secure, but also how we can be more targeted in how we support customers and helping them understand what they can do and what support is available to them in order to navigate the border. So just very quickly, in terms of some of the challenges / opportunities that I think we're kind of grappling with at the minute, I think there's a lot of complexity. And if I just kind of drill down into some of that complexity, I think there's operational complexity. And if we think about the single trade window as being this single digital portal through which customers talk to government at the border, there's a really interesting operational balancing act between getting the right proportion of facilitation and security. It's really important that we make these journeys as simple and pain-free as possible. We need to do that in a way that makes sure that we don't end up compromising the overall security and integrity of the border and the processes that support that. I think from a technical perspective as well, that's a really interesting area of complexity. The technology itself is fast moving and emergent in a lot of cases, and we need to make sure that we are not boxing ourselves into technology that might be right now, but isn't going to be right in 5 years' time. And so being able to make substantive progress while also giving ourselves the future flexibility to enable us to respond to emerging technological trends is a really interesting area of focus for us. And I think also staying in the technical complexity space, just managing data. Single trade window is at its heart a data program, and making sure that we get the management, the flow, the orchestration of the data that customers share with us, again, is a really key part of our kind of future success. The third area of complexity that I just want to quickly touch on, Chris, is around trust. And there is a digital trust element to that, as Pamela articulated a few minutes ago. I think there are also some less tangible elements to that trust complexity as well. How do we make sure that we've got the right trust between government and industry and traders in order to get that working relationship where we want it to be between government and industry, so we can exploit the benefits and the opportunities that single trade window presents? But I think there's also something for me around how do we make sure we've got the right trust within trade and within supply chains, because one of the big wins that single trade window can offer is being able to make it easier to find information that is within your supply chain that government is interested in. And for us to get that right, part of it's about the technology, but part of it's around making sure we've got the right trust within supply chains, so people are comfortable sharing relevant information safely and securely in order to make everyone's kind of processes more straightforward. But I think genuinely, Chris, just in finishing, I think all of these are fantastic opportunities to genuinely transform at the border. And it's exciting to be part of a global community, a genuine global community. There's lots of authorities around the world who are at various stages of development with the single trade windows. And in the UK, we've just recently gone into our private beta to offer and test our very first bits of functionality. And so we're now at the stage where we are getting live users in a safe environment to actually push transactions through the single trade window. And that's really exciting for us, and it's given us really good learning as we start to plan our future iterations over the coming months and years. So exciting times, Chris, and back over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, definitely exciting times. I think this all goes back to what Pamela just said earlier on, isn't it? Is the building blocks are really coming into place in a big way, aren't they? And I think for those of us in the UK, it's really exciting with single trade windows at the same sort of stage as the rest of us. So there's a sort of opportunity at scale to sort of really link it all together and create a sort of template model that could be useful for others as well. So Nick, I noticed the questions are starting to roll in. Please do ask more, those in the audience. We'll try and get through as many of those as we possibly can. And then I've noticed a few of those are on LEIs already. We will have plenty of time if you're with us tomorrow, both in the launch of the report and also the networking opportunities. So don't forget, this is just the start. So Nick, we are learning super fast. I think we've learned a terrific amount, haven't we, over the last few months since the publishing of the Seize the Moment report. It'd be good to share some of that context in terms of, if I can ask you some specific questions on the scale up, which is, you know, where you are absolutely at the front end. Yeah. Who are we now seeing as the key audiences? Because I think that's a really critical question. I'm going to come to Pamela on that on the standards in a minute. Yeah. You know, what can we share in terms of where we go next and how do we do this?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So just to add one further tool to Pamela's toolbox is our treaty network. We shouldn't forget that the UK, what everyone thinks of our current international relations and the events of 2016, we've got some excellent FTAs and DEAs across the globe. And of course, we've acceded to CPTPP as well, the Comprehensive Partnership, Pacific Trading Partnership, which all have excellent provisions in them for digital cooperation and legal alignment. So it to go along with the fantastic representation we've got on this panel. Just think how much of the globe is actually covered by this panel. It's just it's you know, in a sense it's mind-boggling. But the tools are all there. And I think a lot of the people on this call will also be the people who will deploy those tools. But we need somebody to pay for their services. That's the critical bit. So for me, the absolutely critical thing now is to say, here is our report, which shows the benefits which are accessible by real traders in real processes in real time. But those are just one-off pilot examples. What we now need is for those large tier one companies, those international trading entities, to say, yes, I've got a lot of challenges coming my way. They could be regulatory in terms of sustainability, corporate sustainability reporting obligations, security of supply chain. How do I know that the activities of terrorists in the Red Sea isn't going to interrupt my supply? And certainly climate change and other risks which are really challenging. I'm not saying that digitalization can solve all of those, but it would certainly put companies in a position to anticipate the response to risks and to also exploit the fact that many people, including and especially the younger generations, will pay more for well provenanced and proven provenanced production. So there is a commercial and a regulatory driver for the big tier one companies internationally to be the advocates of this, invest in it, and to make sure that their supply chains too adopt this. And I think this is where we are focusing our efforts in the center, is to provide more real life use cases, get more of those tier one suppliers recognizing it, feeding that into governments, both here in the UK and in other countries, but also aligning it with the work that others on the panel are doing in that global environment. So we want those tier one suppliers to get LEIs, to understand the standards to the extent they need to, and also to recognize that this is a global impetus. And if we in the UK, or if a particular country doesn't get on board, there is a risk that they will compromise their own competitiveness as a result. So now is the time to focus on those BCOs, the beneficial cargo owners, really get them engaged, and they will bring the rest with them, I think. That's why our motto is industry-led, government-supported.
Great. And we should mention, shouldn't we, in the report in November, we identified 7 to 8 teams in corporates. We've since now narrowed that down to 2 teams.
Yeah.
Corporate treasurers on the finance side, key audience, and global supply chain managers on the other. And of course, those two work together on end-to-end transactions. So, we really homed it in, I think. And then we've also identified key sectors, the biggest high value, high volume. And the good news is we've really seen the first sectoral example of scale up here in the mining and minerals community.
Yep.
The largest 9 of 10 commodity players have gone from 2% electronic EBLs or thereabouts to now up to 50, 60%. It's extraordinary progress in a very short space of time. In other words, they've hit tipping point. The opportunity for us now is to learn from that and replicate it into retail, food and drink, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, and those other big high value volume sectors. So, really, really exciting stuff. We've got the questions rolling. So I'm tempted here. I'm going to ask Pamela one question because I think that's really relevant to this. And then I'm going to leap into the questions. But Pamela, if I can ask you, obviously the standards piece is the big one, isn't it? That's what's going to connect the data, the systems, the platforms across the jurisdictions. Who is the key audience? Where do we get started? I think our sort of thinking is probably best to start with the systems providers who can actually implement the standards into the solutions that the corporates will be asking for. Are we right in that assumption, do you think, to start with?
I actually think it's going to take a coordinated effort from the systems providers, all right, but also their customers, especially the brands and the owners of the multinational supply chains, who basically set the standards for everything on that must be followed by all the suppliers and the service providers, including the shippers and the logistics providers and so on. Everyone orients to what the brands want because they're the ultimate buyer. So I think getting them involved is really crucial. I think for commodities, it is a great start, and it's, I would say, easier because it's highly concentrated. You've got 10 players there, easily 80 to 90% in some cases. I think it will be, we have to focus on the export intensive sectors where the readiness for digitalization is already quite high. So looking at electronics, auto, heavy industry, and so on. I would love to see retail and consumer brands also transform, but these are very highly fragmented. They're very globalized, spread over a lot of countries. And so I think we're going to have to create those win cases using the big players first in order to provide the business case, to make the business case really clear to those more fragmented supply chains that spread over a lot of emerging markets where the capacity right now is actually quite low. Some of the below the average that Jan was pointing to in terms of trade facilitation and so on. I think the role of the service providers and the platforms and the shippers is also very important. But what we hear from them is, well, we do what our customers want. Same for finance. Banks hold a huge amount of data. They control a huge amount of payments and pathways in trade, but basically they need to move where their customers are moving. So it's a mutual education process. And I think in a lot of cases, we need the government to step in and use their position of authority, not necessarily regulating, but to engage, lead by example. I think the single trade windows are really important for them to adopt globally interoperable standards. And we just all have to kind of educate each other, look at each other, and join up and move together. And the thing is, we're not going to transform global trade in a year. It's going to be inch by inch by inch. But we have to take those gains, because at a certain point, we're going to get to that critical mass, and then it's going to really, really flow. But until then, we just got to keep working hard, take those quick wins, and make sure everybody knows about them.
Yeah, completely agree. So I'm going to go through the questions now. We've got a couple on the LEIs, but if I may, can we leave those till tomorrow? Because I think you're going to get some answers on those two questions when we publish the report. The third question from John's an interesting one. That's a huge question. What is the main pain point that should be addressed now? So if I can just ask each of you, if you can just answer just succinctly, from your perspective, what's the number one pain point? If I'll go around my screen in the order. Claire, you first. I think I know what you're going to say, but go on, say it.
Yeah, indeed, I might be a bit focused in my response, but I would say digital organizational identity. My response here, it will be also referring to the question raised by Joelle in the China Systems, from China Systems in the chat there. So organizational identity, digital organizational identity, what does that mean? How does an organization represent itself in a digital way, allowing for authentication, verification in digital transactions, not just of the organization, but of the delegated authorities, the people that are taking action on behalf of the organization? This could be signing key trade documents. This could be approving receipts of shipments. It's everything across the movement of goods and payments. So if you look across the world, we at the global LEI system, we maintain a listing of what we call registration authorities. So each LEI, the global passport, it connects to the national registry and the national identifier that is associated with that legal entity. So the list of registration authorities around the world is more than 1,000 in length. So to get to a concept of digital organizational identity, you have two choices. Each of those more than 1,000 registries could start to issue a credential to organizations. But the next step for digital trade would be the mutual recognition. So if you have more than 1,000 registries existing, that would mean more than 500,000 mutual recognitions of trust. So let's be honest, massive administrative burden, and it will never happen. And that leads to exclusion. So only key trading partners, key trust frameworks would be recognized. And that's exactly what we want to avoid. So this is the importance of digital organizational identity, the VLEI, enabling a global framework for organizations to represent themselves for the key tasks of authentication, verification in digital transactions, and extending that to the delegated authorities, the persons that are acting on behalf of the organizations.
Great. Just give you a heads up, Max. I don't know if you can see it. There's a great question on single trade window there that comes up a lot on sanctions. I'm going to come to you on that one in a second. Jan, you first, and then you, Nick. Number one pain point. What if there's one thing we focus on going forward? What do you think that must be, Jan?
Well, I mean, again, from my standpoint, right, at the UN and working with governments, right, I mean, it is political will that is a big pain point in many cases, right? Governments are busy doing many things, right? They don't necessarily see this as a top priority issues, although the numbers are there to show that, you know, how much trade cost you can reduce, how much trade misinvoicing you can cut if you really achieve cross-border paperless trade, and we're talking about billions of dollars, right? But putting this on the agenda of all the government is something that is difficult, also because there is diverging interest across stakeholders, right? Actually, it's true in the private sector. It's also true in government, right? The Ministry of Commerce doesn't have the same interest than the Ministry of Digital Economy, then the customs, and you know, then all of this. So putting all of those people together is difficult, and the only way to do this is really to have political will. And so you need to have the top level, prime minister, presidents, you know, taking action on this. And this is why at ESCAP we developed with the member states this UN treaty, right, on cross-border paperless trade facilitation, because we could have issued a general guidelines or guidance, but by making it a treaty, it has to be signed by the prime minister or by the president and submitted to the UN. So once you have done that, it's a long-standing document, and then you potentially create a long-term political will. So let me stop here.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, on the treaty. You raised the treaty and the FTAs yesterday, just earlier on, Nick. I think that's a really, really good point. We certainly picked it up, didn't we, Pamela, in the ASEAN a couple of weeks ago on the Digital Economy Framework Agreement. That sort of lock-in is actually a really important sort of instrument in a way. Nick, biggest pain point, number one that's keeping you up at night?
Money. That's not the Davis family budget, I should say.
I was going to say, is that for you?
I think Claire made this point very well, is in a world where you can digitalize your property in a consignment, where you can digitalize your identity, where you can digitalize the data, and you can digitalize the settlement means, i.e. the money, you've got the prospect of atomic settlement at the border, payment versus delivery. If we can do that, then all that risk management stuff, all that credit risk, all that default risk, all that fraud and trade-based money laundering that Claire referred to, doesn't all disappear, but it is reduced massively, I think. And if we can create a nice compliant and transparent way of doing that, speed up the cash flows. Deutsche Bank reckons there's something like $500 billion as we speak, tied up in settlement. It's neither to the credit of the buyer nor to the credit of the seller. It's sat in limbo, obviously in the banks, not doing anything. If we could just speed that up and get half of that exchange much quicker and much less riskily, then immediately you've got that working capital boost with knock-on effects to productivity, growth, competitiveness, and so on. So if we focus in on that, and that's something I think will work with government as much as it will with industry. If we can get the treasurers saying, I want some of that cash flow benefit, please, and they ask that of their supply chain managers, that's where we'll get the change.
Right. The question I was going to ask, Max, has just been answered by Carl and your team, I think, there. So that's brilliant. Good answer. That comes up a lot around sanctions and export licenses, dual use goods. How does that all fit into what we're talking about here? So that's actually really helpful. I'm just jumping down the questions here. There's a good question there on the ETDA that I'll actually, if I can, just jump to you, Pamela, because you have a really global view, and you've made some interesting comments on this coming from the digital standards. In your mind, has the impact of the Electronic Trade Documents Act in English law, has that met expectations in terms of the impact it's made, bearing in mind we're only in April and it only came into place in September, but has it met your expectations? Had the impact you think that we should expect at this point?
I think so, because the UK is a major economy. It's got a huge trading footprint, and because the passage of the ETDA was not just one thing, it was actually part of an integrated trade strategy, which has seen the UK basically revamp its trade strategy, and built new partnerships, new relationships, establish new trading corridors, which give business the platform and the confidence to go experiment. The biggest issue I think we're facing is that what we're asking businesses to do is actually stop doing something which works imperfectly and try something which you don't know will work. Okay. And that leap into uncertainty is not what people in business generally get rewarded for. So that's why they seek, okay, what's the business case? How am I going to make my return if I invest this much, and get it back within this year? What am I going to do if it doesn't work? Are my trading partners doing so? So they're seeking other reasons to jump on board. And that's why they always say, oh, well, if it's for compliance, I'll do it, because then the choice is out of their hands. And so it's an easy yes. And so I think what the ETDA has done is actually add confidence that the way forward for the UK is digital. And you better get all your investment and your people in this direction, because there's no turning back. And I think that simple signal is actually so essential, which is why actually I know the UK was working for years on this, but the moment that it went into a legislative agenda, that's when business started to invest. It doesn't matter that it took, a year to pass or 6 months to pass, and then another, waiting around for the signatures and so on. Actually, business invests based on expectation, just like stock market. And so what we're seeking is that for all those countries with legislation on the books, business is already starting to move. So and the thing is, it's not just legislation on the books. It can be a statement from the Prime Minister, a statement from trade minister. So as we want to give business the confidence that, yes, you should step into this uncertainty. And until then, we're going to be really keeping pushing for all countries. And we need the UK to kind of continue lead the way, because right now, all of the issues that you're encountering on the single window and on standards and like, how do you put the infrastructure into place? Those are really going to be very, very valuable for the rest of the world. So kudos to the UK for, kind of showing other countries one possible way to do this. Doesn't mean that they're all going to follow in your footsteps, but basically you're laying out a lot of options, which is very, very valuable. And that's the same thing for the UN SCAP's, cross-border paperless trade framework agreement, is that basically you lay out the experiences for everyone to learn from. And so I think, to the extent that we can share more and show each other those case studies, it's going to be hugely valuable.
Thanks so much. No pressure there then, Nick. That should see you through to retirement. There's a fair old job list from Pamela there. Okay, I'm going to come to you, Max. I'm conscious this might be a difficult one for you, but it is an important one. And I'm just going to broaden out the question. It's talking about KYC onboarding processes, the sort of banking systems. But I think if I may just sort of broaden it out, so I think it is an interesting question, certainly for us, but I think also potentially for you, is the role of regulators. One of our board members, actually, from Lloyds Bank, made a very, very good point a week or so ago, in that if we digitalize transactions and you can do a transaction in an hour, that's not very helpful if you then spend 6 months doing your KYC checks. But it's equally important, isn't it, on the customs and border stuff, isn't it? If you speed up one bit of the system, and then there's another bit of the system that's really slow. That's actually then it's a drag on all the other progress that we're making. It's about sort of joined up thinking, isn't it? Do you have a view on that within government? Should the regulators be more engaged or sort of more involved in what we're doing? Because I think our instinctive feeling is we should be doing more with the regulators to sort of sandbox and create more innovative spaces around these difficult areas like KYC.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I guess what I'll offer now is a personal view as opposed to kind of an official kind of government policy, just to make that clear to colleagues. So I think one of the things that really kind of resonates with that question, Chris, is one of the kind of main drivers behind the single trade window, which is we spend a lot of time, quite rightly, talking about the benefits that a single trade window can offer to industry and to traders, large and small, and that's absolutely right and proper, because there is a huge prize there for traders. But I think when we reflect on what opens up for government, it creates an opportunity for government departments to be more joined up, and in turn to be more efficient in how we know our customer, and when I say know our customer, not just from understanding and onboarding into our regulatory framework a new customer or a new entity, but actually how do we keep that knowledge of a customer topped up throughout kind of business life cycles and key events throughout a business's kind of like normal life cycle as well. And so I think for me, there's a push and a pull factor on this one with technological developments like the single trade window. I think getting better, more accurate, more timely sharing of information about a customer and their transactions across government can help departments answer more confidently the questions that already exist, if I can put it that way, and make more effective decisions in isolation, if you like. But I think just having the flow of that information, the confidence of that information, provokes a different set of questions around not just how do we answer the existing questions and meet our existing expectations more efficiently, but how do we actually reframe how we wanted to operate as a joined up government effort at the border. Does it create the opportunity for us to take different approaches to facilitating customers through the border that weren't possible previously because of a lack of confidence in the information that flowed through, because of a lack of confidence in the robustness of the underlying technology? So I think there is definitely an opportunity for us to be more joined up. I think the single trade window and some of the other great work that we're talking about in this forum are positive levers for that. And none of us want to be in a position where we hear those stories around a customer talking to one kind of part of the government effort at the border, and after a little while they're released, only to then go and have to talk to another part of government at the border. We want to avoid that, and I think the challenge for me leading the single trade window, but the challenge for all of us as we move forward is how do we build confidence in the technology and the insight that is emerging, and how do we use that to drive a conversation where we positively challenge ourselves to create journeys that are as facilitative as possible, but also not putting ourselves in a position where we risk undermining the underlying robustness and confidence in our security. And that's the trade-off that government organisations have to grapple with all the time. We want to be facilitative, but also we have to make sure that the security remains kind of at the forefront as well. And so I think forums like this can help to drive that conversation forward and build that evidence base to help kind of move those conversations on. I hope that helps, Chris.
Yeah, no, it does. I think it's a really, really important point that we need to, I think, really focus on in terms of the question earlier on, in terms of what's that key pain point. I think this is in that space that I definitely think deserves a lot more attention, because we all win if we get it right, and we've all got sort of skin in the game. There's a good question for you here, Jan, from Faisal Zishan, which is a really practical one, and I must say I've also struggled with this sometimes, is access to information, isn't it? The question is there any study research available on developing countries about their digital trade readiness assessments? I think I've got a feeling you'd be able to answer that for everybody.
Yes, well, the answer is yes. Actually, I mean, ESCAP is doing lots of studies on this on request by government, right, in Asia and the Pacific. But also we've developed, it's an online tool, right? If you go to readiness.digitalizedtrade.org, right, you have a legal readiness checklist. You've got a technical readiness checklist that everybody can access. And I know, for example, Mexico has been using it, right, without us, because they are outside the Asia Pacific region. And we've published with the WTO and with UNCITRAL a toolkit on cross-border paperless trade, where you can do legal and technical readiness assessment. So yes, it's available. And I think a lot of the development bank, I saw a question on the development banks engaging on digitalization and paperless trade. I mean, a lot of development banks are very much ready to support this. But again, they are waiting for governments to ask them, right, and to prioritize it, right? So that's the key issue. But the tools are there, and I think some of the money is there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just conscious of time, everybody. I just want to ask the panel one final question on where they see the world in a couple of years' time, because I think it's really relevant to all of us. It's also tied into all this expectations, but good questions here. Let's pick these questions up and have more discussion around them tomorrow, because they're really, really relevant to the whole conversation. Sadly, I can't get through them all, which I had a feeling might happen today. So if I can start with you, Pamela, and I'm just going to go around the screen quickly. In your world, 3 years' time, what are we doing differently that we're not doing today?
So I actually see that the majority of countries which are dominating global trade will actually be more or less over the critical mass point and transacting in digital. That's processes at the border and also B2B processes, and that we will have kind of mastered the art of choosing interoperable data and document standards. I think it's going to be hard work, because we need to massively educate and to massively converge industry behavior. But I think there's enough readiness now, and there's enough awareness now of the benefits of interoperability and the promise of secure data sharing. But yeah, so in 2 to 3 years' time, the majority of global trade in the digital ecosystem.
That sounds great. Claire.
Foolish. No, ambitious, but perhaps foolish.
We're all with you. We're with you. Claire, same question to you.
Yes, so I'll come back to those 3 words: digital organizational identity. This will no longer be a concept where you kind of scratch your head and say, what does that mean? But it will be embedded into organizational processes, onto the onboarding of new employees, ensuring that delegated authorities are given credentials, are managed at the organizational level to enable that ecosystem to develop, where transactions are digital and with the appropriate level of trust and verifiability to enable that ecosystem that Pamela describes. Trust at the border in the exchanges of documents, of goods, of payments.
Yeah, sounds good. Nick, same question.
Yeah, I'd go with 2 words: atomic settlement. So I think if we can get the money sorted, I think we will have the sort of transparent, accountable, and real-time supply chain management capabilities that goodness me, we need if we're going to save the planet, to be frank. So I see this as being a principal mechanism for delivering on net zero, sustainability, and inclusion.
That sounds fantastic too. We've got 1 minute, I think. Jan, you first, and then Max, same question.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, so where do you think we'll be in 3 years' time?
I hope we will have the private sector actively communicating with government, right, and really adopting the similar systems in order that they are compatible, right? Because this is one of the issues. The government are trying to do something, the private sector is trying to do something, and so we need to get them to work together. So I'm not sure we'll be there in 3 years, but I hope so.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. That coordination point is so important, isn't it? Max, same question. Where will we be?
So I might be slightly narrowing my focus here from a single trade window perspective, but I think in a few years' time we're going to be in a position where sharing data and reusing data is going to be much more commonplace, and we're going to have customers who are not having to run around chasing their tails in order to get information from the supply chains, because it is just there, and we're reusing that. I also want to see more people using the border, because we will have removed perceived barriers to entry, and people will be saying, actually, the border is something that can be navigated with confidence, not something that provides a stop to my ability to operate in new markets. And finally, I think, you know, where we are in a few years' time, I think some of that international cooperation and interoperability that we want to achieve across single trade windows, I'd like to think that we'll be moving from kind of concept to actually kind of testing how that works in practice. And I think if we start to push through that door, then I think we just start to really maximise the impact of what we're doing here. So I think it's a really exciting few years ahead of us. It'll be challenging, but really exciting, and I can't wait to see where we get to. Thanks, Chris.
That's it. So there you have it. We're 1 minute over, so I'm going to quickly wrap up. But there you've got 5 bold voices. We're going to be living in quite a different world. It all sounds terrific to me. I'm sure we'll all support this. So a great call to action in a way. Let's really make this happen over the next 3 years. We've got more sessions to come. Thank you so much for your time. Wherever you are in the world or UK time zones, it's been great to have you. I'm sorry I didn't answer all the questions or we get them all answered, but we'll do our best certainly to follow those up tomorrow. Thank you very much. I hope this has been useful as a scene setter for the next day and a half, and look forward to seeing those of you tomorrow who can be with us. Thank you very much, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you.